Oh, my name is Larry Diamond, and I am delighted to be with you for this conference in memory of our beloved late colleague, Shmuel Eisenstadt. I am Larry Diamond. I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I will be talking about why we are in a global democratic recession. So I will share my screen and present my slides, and hopefully everyone will be able to see them. I want to first present evidence that we are in a global democratic recession. As you see from this slide, we have reached a peak around 2006 in terms of the percentage of states with populations over 1 million population that can be considered to be a democracy because they can choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections. That's the blue line here. And you see during the third wave of global democratization, the percentage of democracies among states in the world with populations over 1 million increased from 24% to slightly over half when the Soviet Union fell and the Cold War ended, gradually peaked at 57%, and has since subsided to around 44%. The percentage of liberal democracies with a strong rule of law peaked also in the early 2000s around 34% and has declined only slightly. It's worth noting that the United States has been actually one of the big decliners among democracies in the world. If you use the 100-point Freedom House scale of political rights and civil liberties, the United States has declined from a peak of 94 around the start of the Democratic recession in 2007. And it steadily declined during the Obama era as political polarization became more severe. And then with the election of Trump, it really plummeted further from around 89 out of 100 to 83, making the US among these eight advanced industrial democracies, in essence. What you're seeing here are the G7 countries plus Sweden, making the United States the least democratic of all of these countries, according to Freedom House. Here you see a very famous Freedom House slide of the ratio of countries gaining in freedom to the number declining each year, beginning with the end of the Cold War in 1991. And during the glory days of the democratic expansion following the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, you had often 2.5 times as many countries gaining in freedom as declining. One year was 3 times as many. Beginning in 2007, this reverses, and for most of the years since then, only about 70% as many countries have gained in freedom as the number that have declined. And in recent years, it's been more like 50, 60%. In 2023, it was 40%. When you then look at not freedom, but democracy, democratic breakdowns, and democratic transitions, these are the 5 decades since the start of the third wave of global democratization in 1974 with the Portuguese Revolution. And in the first decade of this 50-year period, post-third wave, or during the third wave, about a sixth of all democracies broke down in the first decade. And then the failure rate fell dramatically to 7%, and then it's been creeping up to 10%, 13%. In the last decade, from 2014 through 2023, 18% of all the democracies that existed in that decade failed. By the same token, the rate of democratic transition has been declining. The percentage of states that are autocracies and made transitions to democracy was about 20% during the first decade of the third wave, 1974 to 1983. And in the next decade, which included the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, about half of all the authoritarian regimes in the world made transitions to democracy. Then that transition rate fell to 22% to 20%, and in the last decade, only 13% of all the autocracies that existed between 2014 and 2023 made transitions to democracy. And so you see the problem that while 5 times as many countries made transitions to democracy as the ones that lost democracy between 1984 and 1988, that ratio has been declining since. And in the last few years, only about 14% as many countries have made transitions to democracy as the much greater number that had democratic breakdowns. Here you see the trends for the Freedom House annual survey of freedom on the world, configured from 0 to 100. That average score for each year has fallen from nearly 59 to 52 between 2006 and 2023. That's an 11% drop. And with the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, not quite as big in percentage terms a slide, but still a pretty steady slide. So the question then becomes, why have we been in a global democratic recession? What's behind all this? I begin by noting the role of both norms and institutions. Normative commitments have been eroding among elites who feel increasingly emboldened to do whatever they want. And there's been eroding public trust in democratic institutions and declining legitimacy. I put a big emphasis on the demise of civic education. We aren't building and cultivating the values of democracy, freedom, and as you see on college campuses in the United States, rational discourse is also lacking. We have a lot of work to do to cultivate the culture of democracy. Social media has played a big role in this. It's coarsened our civic life. It has severely polarized us, and I think it is a major factor in the decline of the quality and stability of democracy around the world. And then we have to contend with authoritarian propaganda and sharp power by Russia and China. Also, we see less accountability in the world. Horizontal accountability is weakened, in particular the rule of law, control of corruption. Bottom-up accountability from society has weakened, and with it, polarization and undemocratic norms have intensified. External accountability from the international donors is weakened, and I think people's own internal normative restraints have also weakened with polarization and some of these other trends. We are facing a very disturbing reality of weaker political institutions. Political parties are not what they once were. Legislators are more easily dominated and sidelined than they used to be, and we have to think about how to revive them. We have weaker courts, and we have illiberal figures who are beating up on the media, on the universities, on religious institutions. and trying to politicize the state for their own aggrandizement of power, and politicize the police and the public security forces, when you've got the deep structure of the civil service, the police, public security agencies, the intelligence apparatus being politicized and losing their institutional autonomy. These are very, very dangerous signs. Many countries also have been losing democracy because their democracies have not performed well in economic and political terms. Obviously, growth is an important factor here. People want jobs, they want social security, they want some degree of predictability. Education is important for improving human capital and national competitiveness. I think a very big factor indeed, I find that it's very hard to talk about the failure of democracy without identifying corruption and crony capitalism as important features. Any political system that can control corruption and the particularistic capture and distribution of the benefits of exercising state power, if they can control that, they've got a decent chance at sustaining democracy. And if they can't, people get disillusioned. So extreme and rising inequality is another important variable. People want some degree of equity across groups, across countries, across cultures, across times. People want to be treated equally. And extreme inequality is an enemy of democracy and the rule of law. I think we have to get serious about controlling crime and gang violence. This has been a major threat in Latin America. It's a major reason why Nayib Bukele was able to sweep aside democratic norms and restraints and set himself up as essentially a dictatorial authority in El Salvador. And we have a number of areas of very weak governance. When government is not working well, when democracy is not resolute and effective, a vicious cycle of poor performance sets in. And this vicious cycle has the following steps in a sequence. The state performs poorly. People don't think they're getting much from the state, and so they withdraw it. They take away their compliance. They take away their resources, and the money goes somewhere else. And the state becomes diminished in its capacity to do anything. Compliance with the tax code erodes, maybe compliance with the whole legitimate order of political authority. Crime and corruption increase in these circumstances. And then principled elites withdraw from politics because it looks like politics isn't working to help people. It looks like politics is corrupt. And in this circumstance, populists thrive, people who promise to do something to help ordinary people and who point their finger at the authorities, the state, and not necessarily the more adroit political interests. When the vicious cycle of government performance really takes hold, you don't get good performance. What you get is capture of the state. And politics focuses on the distribution of what we call private goods and club goods, not the broad public goods of schools and healthcare and public order that lead people to have some confidence in the state. When you have all this happening, you're going to get increasing cynicism, you're going to get increasing distrust. You pray that it will abate and yield to more rational and effective governance, but that's usually not what happens. When people are cynical, when people are distrusting, they turn to illiberal populists, rulers who are willing to look the other way at corruption or utilize it as part of their conquest of power. Added to this is something else very sobering, which is that authoritarianism has been on a roll, and authoritarian models have been diffusing, not only within regions like the former Soviet Union or maybe among the former military regimes of Latin America, but they're spreading more widely. And you have the China model of developmental authoritarianism. You have the Putin or Russian model of a strong leader who can impose his will and restore religious values. You have the Viktor Orban model in Turkey of a kind of postmodern autocracy, quite illiberal. We should have no illusion about that. It's not a democracy, but it's sufficiently vague and they have elections and so on. So some people think that maybe it's democratic enough, which it is not. Then you get Nayib Bukele coming in El Salvador and saying, look, the country's been overwhelmed by drug violence. We're going to crush it. And I don't want to hear about restraints on power. I don't want to hear about a model with complexity and distributed power and checks and balances. People want order. I'm going to deliver order. And with that kind of delivery of order comes authoritarianism. Authoritarianism has also come in the guise, in some African countries, of very religiously conservative values and modes of campaigning. Extreme religious chauvinism doesn't tend to go along very well with liberal democracy, whether it's of the right-wing intolerant variety that is spreading across parts of sub-Saharan Africa now, in hostility, in particular to the LGBTQ community, whether it is the Hindu chauvinism of Narendra Modi, extreme visions of religious purity and religious intolerance cannot be consistent with liberal democracy and often represent a threat to democracy of any kind. I want to speak for a moment to why 2006 appears to have been a turning point. What happened then? What was happening in the world around that time? And what was happening was, first of all, the US had invaded Iraq. It didn't go well at all. And this led to a decline in support for democracy promotion. Around that time, preceding it and following it was accelerating globalization, increased movement of people, of goods, of capital. But countries were losing control, and particularly countries in Europe were losing control of their borders, or at least that was a narrative that extreme right-wing elements could push back against immigration with. And this had some resonance in the United States and contributed to Donald Trump's election as president of the United States in 2006. We had the instability of the global financial crisis in 2008. We've had rising inequality within nations, increased anxiety among working class people and others who became less secure in their jobs, less tolerant of uncertainty. And with this rose social media and its extreme polarizing impact in separating people into warring camps and being such a ready tool of exploitation by Russia in particular, but other malign external actors as well, in setting different parts of the population against one another, which we know was a major purpose of Russian propaganda in terms of its penetration of social media platforms around this time, and the way it was reorganizing politics, reorganizing discussions. And then we have to note that the United States is not as powerful as it once was. Neither is Europe or the NATO alliance. And we now have in the world really beginning to gain momentum around 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, a new China, a China that was more self-confident, a China that was no longer going to hide its strength and bide its time, in the language that Deng Xiaoping often quoted in appeals for restraint and a little bit of, frankly, duplicity. And Russia was coming back under Vladimir Putin. Now, I want to say in conclusion that these trends can be resisted and they can be successfully confronted in the form of illiberal populism that we often see them taking. I think the Istanbul mayor, Ekrem Imamoglu, has been an example, and with his stunning and massive re-election last month, quite an inspiring example of a politician who pushes the other way, of trying to depolarize and create a broader context rather than outpolarize the polarizer in chief. Build a broad base. Don't mimic the populist penchant for verbal abuse, but rise to a more substantive and forceful level of showing humility and even empathy, or the campaign of radical love previously in Turkey, but with a positive issues-based campaign agenda that can point out the corruption and failing of the authoritarian populist and win back public support. Winning back public support requires winning back nationalism, winning back patriotism, and fusing a civic nationalism with pride in and defense of democracy. With that comes an optimistic vision of the future and of the economy and the greater social justice that could be under democracy. And it's on that optimistic note that I want to end. And thank you so much. And I wish you a wonderful conference.